London is a charnel house. The year is 1649, and the world has tilted on its axis. In the shadow of the scaffold at Whitehall, the axe has fallen, the king's blood has stained the winter snow, and the ancient, hallowed hierarchy of England has been put to the sword by a rabble of psalm-singing shopkeepers. For the men of the high court, the younger sons of the great manors, the knights of the king's horse, the masters of the silk and the sword, the home of their ancestors is gone. But 3,000 miles to the west, across a gray and unforgiving Atlantic, there is a home to which they might flee, and indeed to which they are already being invited to flee. Imagine a lone merchantman beating its way up the James River, the salt spray still crusting the fine velvet of a passenger's doublet. He stands at the rail, a man whose very silhouette is rebellion against the drab, gray world of Cromwell's England. He wears the lovelocks of the royalist court, and they tumble down to his collar, which is a beautiful cascade of Flemish lace. His rapier is not a prop, but a seasoned instrument of war that was all too recently impaled in a Roundhead before the horrible flight at Marston Moor. It is a dashing and attractive look, but perhaps one unsuited to the sultry and pestiferious environment in which he's about to find himself. As the ship moors against a jagged pier of raw timber in this horrid new environment, with mosquitoes already buzzing about, nothing but a ragged little town and primordial forest in sight, he steps off into the sandy shores of Jamestown. His Spanish leather boots are instantly caked in the filth and muck that washes up upon deep and dark forest, but his gaze is fixed on the horizon and his outlook positive. He has not come here to settle in the way a refugee flees a fire. He has come as a transplant who plans on civilizing this place and recreating the home he was forced to flee by those horrid, rebellious fanatics and their blackened buckles. In his heavy sea chest, he carries the silver plate upon which is stamped the ancient crest of his family. The classical texts of his education are in there too, and he carries with him an ironclad conviction that he was born to command, to rule, and that this wilderness is the final redoubt where an English gentleman can still carve a kingdom out of the earth. This is not a story of humble pioneers. This is the story of a strategic relocation of a civilization. It is the tale of the distressed Cavalier, a class of men who lost a kingdom in the old world and decided, with a calculated ferocity, to build a new one in the new. This is the Virginia Cavalier. But is he a man or is he a myth? We'll find out. Welcome back to The Old World with Will Tanner, the show where we tell the tales of the great colonial adventurers and magnificent American and British families of the world that used to exist. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share the video around if you like it. That's how we grow and keep this project going. Last time, we began the series on Virginia, describing why Virginia developed the plantation system as it did, and why tobacco was integral creation to both that system and the famous topping people who profited so handsomely from it. This time, we're dissecting the myth of the Virginia Cavalier, diving deep to discuss whether such fellows really were real, or if they were just myths in the minds of colonials who wished to point to a genteel heritage that was really just a figment of their overactive imaginations. Which was it? Were the famed Cavaliers of Virginia real? You'll have to listen to the end to find out. While the mother country was descending into the bloody chaos of the 1640s, as neighbor turned against neighbor at Edge Hill, Marston Moor, and Nasby, Virginia was forced to decide what kind of civilization it intended to be. This was a global struggle for the English identity, and the Chesapeake was its second front. Would it be Cavalier or Puritan? In 1649, when news of the regicide reached Jamestown, the reaction was one of cold, calculated defiance. Under the leadership of Governor Sir William Berkeley, the House of Burgesses issued a proclamation that echoed like a cannon shot. They denounced the abominable act, declared it high treason to doubt the divine right of the king's son, Charles II, and, under Berkeley's wishes, invited Cavaliers to flee from Cromwell and to Virginia. Meanwhile, Richard Lee I, a member of the illustrious Lee family we'll soon have so much to say about, was sent to be the governor's representative at Charles II's exiled court. This is when Virginia became the Old Dominion, the one remaining corner of the English world where the old banners still flew, and the king's right to rule remained respected and honored rather than trampled upon by Cromwell and the levelers and diggers in his legions. It was the beating heart of tradition, of real England herself. But the parliamentarians in London, led by the iron-willed Oliver Cromwell, would not tolerate a rebel colony so openly defying their authority, and so sent a fleet that, in 1652, appeared in the Chesapeake, guns run out, demanding surrender. A fight could have been had, but was avoided as the two sides came to terms. The colonials would get rid of their rabidly pro-Cavalier governor, Sir William Berkeley, and things would otherwise largely continue as they had been. Parliament was claiming control, but Berkeley struck a good deal by threatening to fight, and so little really changed. He was technically deposed and forced into retirement at his vast Green Spring estate, one he had built up into a thriving plantation over the years. He was out of power, but the parliamentarians were unable to significantly reorder the colony. The political head had been removed, but the social body remained firmly Cavalier. Berkeley's allies controlled the county courts and the land office, and so the Puritan commissioners lacked the local leverage to dismantle the hierarchy that had been built. The Old Dominion simply pulled its lace collars tight and waited out the protectorate, maintaining its royalist soul under a nominal parliamentarian peace. To understand the friction between the Cavalier and the Puritan, particularly as it came to be applied in Virginia, one must look past the superficialities of lace and plaincloth. Yes, the Cavalier did reject the austere Puritans by cutting a dashing and picturesque picture with his doublet of silk, satin, or velvet, slashed up the front with its large and loose sleeves and the band of Van Dyke lace, around which the loose curls of his hair fell, framing a face sharp with a peaked beard and small, upward-turned mustache, and over which sat, of course, his broad-brimmed hat with rich hatband and plume. But this was not a disagreement over the length of one's hair, nor even over the liturgy of a Sunday service or the abominable execution of King Charles I. It was a profound conflict regarding the purpose of a human life and the very architecture of a functioning society. The Cavalier view, particularly of leisure, was that it was the essential ingredient. They understood that to rule effectively, a man had to be objective, and objectively required a soul untethered from the drudgery of the plow, work which they believed shriveled the mind, rendering it parochial and unfit for the public burden of rule. To them, asking a man who labored for his daily bread to sit in judgment on the county court was as nonsensical as asking a foot to see for the body. This leisure was not, as the modern critic might suggest, an invitation to idleness. It was a rigorous apprenticeship for command. This was the seigneurial ideal, a society organized as a living organism where every part knew its station. The hands were vital for the extraction of wealth from the soil, but they could never be expected to direct the head. In the Cavalier's mind, a gentleman's status was not an ornament, it was a functional requirement for the maintenance of a classical, ordered civilization. In stark contrast stood the Puritan gospel of labor, a new and shockingly egalitarian doctrine that the Cavalier Gentry viewed not as a virtue, but as a moral vacuum. For the Puritan, God was glorified through the disciplined, methodical application of labor to the earth, a calling that made the independent family farm critical. Their goal was competency, a state of being where a man was beholden to no master because he worked his own land. This, by necessity, required a colony not of great and noble lords ruling over vast estates, but of small farms. So, while the Puritans sought a society of egalitarian smallholders, all of whom had a competency and who worked religiously, literally, the Cavalier sought a society of masters and servants, believing that only this could sustain the libraries, the law, and the liturgical grace of a true English gentleman. Under the Cavalier view, there was to be no land without a lord. Property, church, and government were to be united as one force for tradition and rule based on that which the combination afforded. This was a critical difference. As Morris Talipar notes in his The Sociology of Colonial Virginia, speaking of the fight between Puritan and Cavalier, Quote, "The difference between them were profound and irreconcilable. Tradition wanted the union of the state, church, and property, while the cornerstone of the Puritan sociology was the freedom, or the separation, of property from state and church, and theirs was a struggle for mastery, not as between persons or political parties, but as between sociologies or ways of life, each with its own institutions and values." End quote. Because the Cavalier could not work without losing his qualification to rule, he required a permanent, subservient labor force. The sprawling, isolated tobacco estate was the physical manifestation of his theology. By the time the topping people solidified their hold on the Tidewater, they had effectively banned the gospel of labor from the halls of government, ensuring that the Old Dominion would remain a land where the elite exercised a divinely sanctioned stewardship over a world that they alone were equipped to understand and to lead. This dichotomy ignited a localized struggle within the Tidewater itself. Virginia had its own Puritans, concentrated in regions like Nansemond and Lower Norfolk. These were men who wanted to build a society of egalitarian smallholders. To the gentry, these Puritans were a structural threat and were crushed, particularly with the passing of the Act of Uniformity in 1647, to harass and exile these Roundhead elements, ensuring that the hierarchical, labor-free ideal of the gentry faced no local competition. That society required the church, specifically the Church of England. But back in England, Cromwell had suppressed it. The pillars of society no longer held. Tradition could not be defended, nor the basis of a functioning civilization of the sort the Cavaliers thought necessary. Further, the demands and clamoring of the levelers, of the diggers, of those more radical and more egalitarian voices amongst the Puritans, who not only wanted to abolish the House of Lords and the monarchy, as Cromwell ended up doing, but to abolish the landed estates of England, and perhaps property itself, indicated that private property, as held and respected by the great and noble, might soon be on the chopping block as well. And, of course, the Cavaliers weren't governing any longer. The Lords was disbanded. They were still struggling to pay onerous fees and taxes. The Long Parliament was hostile to the Cavalier Gentry for obvious reasons. The world had turned upside down as the Puritans inflicted their radical ideas on England. This was intolerable. With the Church of England suppressed at home, themselves out of power, and their estates at risk, a great migration of Cavaliers to Virginia began. It actually began in the early 1640s, with a strategic vanguard, the younger sons of the English gentry who possessed the capital to move and the foresight to see the writing on the wall as the king's authority began to erode. These early movers were not yet distressed Cavaliers like those of a later date. They were opportunistic. They arrived in the Tidewater while the rivers were still open and the best land was still a matter of simple patenting. They utilized their wealth, startup capital, if you will, to engross the primary riverfront tracts, laying the physical, proprietary foundations for a seigneurial society before the first shot of the Civil War was even fired. They were the architects of the early manor, preparing the ground for a social order that would soon be tested by the fires of revolution at home. Their arrival was key, for they showed both that gentlemen could live well in Virginia and showed the path to becoming a great lord in Virginia by arriving with a bit of capital rather than starting with nothing, as the indentured servants did. Nearly all of the families later influential in the state arrived as such, using what small portions they had as second sons or saved capital from lives as merchants to start ahead in Virginia, with an army of servants and many hundreds or thousands of acres in their possession. The second act, the one people think of, the defining influx of the distressed Cavaliers, commenced with the fall of the King's Head. As England descended into the drab, gray winter of Cromwell's protectorate, Sir William Berkeley offered up Virginia into being a deliberate sanctuary for the Cavaliers, the political party who had sided with the Royalist cause, and particularly had served as its officer class. To be clear, these were generally not nobles he was inviting in, nor even heirs of nobles. They were Cavaliers in their affiliations, in their views, in their understanding of how society ought work. But they were men of quality, and while they had lost much to the sequestrations and fines of the Commonwealth, they nevertheless arrived in the Chesapeake not as humble refugees, but as battle-hardened colonels and knights of the King's Horse, carrying the weight of a kingdom that had been snatched from them. Under Berkeley's active recruitment and patronage, these men sought to rebuild their shattered status through vast, sprawling land patents, particularly in the northern neck and the Tidewater. To them, Virginia was the final redoubt, where the seigneurial ethos could be reconstructed with an ironclad permanence that the old world and its rotten commonwealth no longer allowed. This was the famous period in which the Cavaliers of legend arrived. Never more than but a small fraction of the emigres to Virginia over this period, perhaps a few hundred or a few thousand at the most maximalist interpretation, of the tens of thousands who migrated from England to Virginia in this period, their wealth and attractive culture made them nevertheless disproportionately influential. Further, they did well with marrying into what landed society already existed in Virginia, thus further solidifying their dominance. As Clifford Doughty notes in The Great Plantation, quote, "The Cavaliers came during the Protectorate, and though many yeoman families regarded them with indifference or even hostility, the attractive refugees from a reign of Puritans found many doors open to them, and, more practically, many hearts. The charming gentlemen were very successful at marrying widows whose husbands had worked themselves to death acquiring land and clearing acres for tobacco, or, as bold traders, had fallen afoul of Indian raiding parties. Then as now, fathers who had known a hard, rough life were pleased to place their daughters in the hands of a young gallant who could advance her socially." End quote. And so they entrenched themselves in the wealth elite of the colony. The final consolidation occurred between 1660 and 1675 as the restoration of the monarchy brought the definitive architects of the cousinage into being. These were the men who came to join kinsmen already entrenched as the topping people. While Richard Lee I, for example, had already secured the family's footing as early as 1639, this later era saw the arrival of men like William Randolph, the Adam of Virginia, so he was called because he had so many progeny, who turned a clerkship into a vast empire. It was in this window that the disparate elite lines began to intermarry and weave the dynastic web that would eventually produce the Thomas Lees and George Washingtons of the Golden Age. By 1675, the DNA of this ruling class was largely set. They were no longer just English exiles, but a closed, interlocked American gentry. And it was the Cavaliers who set the tone for what they would become as a gentry. Yes, most of those who became the first families of Virginia and topping people were largely of mercantile rather than gentry backgrounds, the Anglo-Norman descended Lees and Wormleys excepted. But the real Cavaliers, again, of whom there were never many, served as a social leaven. They brought their culture and view of life with them, and it imbued the spirit of Virginia. The other successful men, the proto-gentry that generally came from merchant lines, saw Cavalier culture as it filled their colony. They liked it, adopted it, and embodied it. As Lewis B. Wright notes in his The First Gentleman of Virginia, quote, "A considerable number of the 17th century settlers did come from families of the gentry, enough, perhaps, to serve as a leaven for the developing aristocracy, enough to set an example of the manners and behavior of English country gentlemen." End quote. And so those who either were second sons themselves or whose ancestors had been second sons and so filled the ranks of the mercantile and professional classes found in the New World a chance to be Cavalier gentlemen, maybe even topping grandees. As Morris Talipar put it in his The Sociology of Colonial Virginia, these men, quote, "determined by their values rather than by their blood." Whether Virginia's leading immigrants after 1640 had all fought for the Stuart cause or not, and whatever their consanguinity, they were ideologically Cavalier, and they organized their society accordingly. End quote. It was Governor Berkeley who made this happen. Influential even when deposed, the governor for decades before and after the Commonwealth, Governor Berkeley was the architect who curated an elite by ensuring the leaven of the Cavalier emigres made Virginia a Cavalier colony rather than falling into the trap of Puritanism. This curation was most evident in his transformation of the Council of State. Under Berkeley's hand, the council ceased to be a mere advisory body and became a citadel of the gentry. He systematically bypassed the successful mechanics and wealthy traders of Jamestown, hand-picking his advisors exclusively from the ranks of the men of quality, most of whom had arrived in the Cavalier waves. He sought out the younger sons of the English gentry or peerage and the battle-hardened royalist officers, binding them to his administration through a web of prestige and political monopoly, along with the riches that came with it. By the 1660s, the council had generally become a closed shop, a hereditary House of Lords in the American forest, where a handful of interlinked families held the keys to the province's legal and military heart. This ensured the political culture and the social culture of Virginia remained largely Cavalier in orientation, and that the great landed families controlled the politics, not the yeomen or the merchants. Berkeley's most potent tool of hegemony, however, was his command of the land office. He understood the immense importance of every larger tract of fertile land in the tobacco economy that was Virginia, knowing that land was the very soil of status and the basis of essentially all wealth. He utilized the land patent system as a structural solvent to dissolve the influence of smallholders and crystallize the power of his fellow Cavaliers by granting vast, strategic tracts, most notably in the northern neck and along the deep water reaches of the James and York rivers, to a select group of Cavaliers and topping people who had arrived in the successive waves, a group that largely became the so-called cousinage, or the first families. He ensured that the best virgin land was engrossed by those he deemed fit to rule, and that they held it in large tracts in their plantations. This was a deliberate social engineering. He ensured that when the next generation of Virginia's elite looked out from their porticos, they would see not a patchwork of independent farms, but a continuous, seigneurial domain of great estates farmed by their laborers to support them in lifestyles of leisure so that they could rule. The result was a unified royalist front that proved remarkably resilient to the political tremors of the Old World. By aligning the material interests of the gentry, the high church liturgy, and the royalist cause, Berkeley created a class that was ideologically and economically inseparable, as a Cavalier class understood society should be. It was also one that was closed not just to most new men, but even to most gentlemen moving to Virginia. As Clifford Doughty notes, Governor Berkeley's council and land grants had, quote, fixed the mold of the colony over which they had fought. No more Cavaliers need come. From then on, Virginia would produce its own homegrown, self-made aristocrats. The nucleus was already there, fixed in power by the old despot, and this ruling caste would perpetuate itself through intermarriages, end quote. This was the topping people in their purest form, a closed, interlocked elite increasingly born and bred in Virginia, and who viewed the governance of Virginia as their ancestral right and the maintenance of hierarchy as their sacred duty. Berkeley didn't just give them land, he gave them an effective monopoly on the government, and thus on the future. He ensured that, even after he was gone, the Old Dominion would remain a world governed by the silk and the sword, a place where the seigneurial ideal would flourish come what may in England. The Puritan elements that had been in Virginia from the beginning were crushed and chased away, with the state becoming what it was known as. Also critical to this process was the defense of the Anglican Church in Virginia. The High Church of England was transplanted not just as a religion, but as a social binder. In the Cavalier mind, church, property, and government were a single intertwined organism. The church was, thus, a pillar of the landed estate's authority. This was one of the reasons so many Cavaliers left England for Virginia. In the architecture of the Old Dominion, the Anglican parish was far more than a site of Sunday devotion and Sunday fraternizing amongst the locals, who generally did much more socializing in the yard than worshiping in the pews on Sundays. No, the parish was the primary sociological and administrative unit of the seigneurial ideal. While the county court governed the high matters of law and property, it was the vestry, the local church board, that solidified gentry rule and governance of the colony. To the Cavalier, the parish was the state in miniature, a microcosm where the topping people exercised a divinely sanctioned stewardship of their people. Membership in the vestry was the ultimate badge of local hegemony. There was no democratic assembly. It was a self-perpetuating collection. The 12 most prominent gentlemen in the parish, each appointed by his leading fellows and approved by the governor, Once a man was elected to the vestry, he typically served for life, and when a vacancy occurred, the remaining members handpicked his successor from their own ranks, ensuring that the cousinage remained the undisputed masters of the local machinery. This vestryman was almost always the same man who sat as a justice on the county court or represented the county in the House of Burgesses. This fusion of secular and sacred authority ensured that the leadership of Virginia was a narrow collection of aligned gentry interests who rooted the legitimacy of their rule in the soil and in the church. Ultimately, the vestry served as the moral custodian of the Cavalier order. It was here that the seigneurial ideal met the daily life of the common man. The vestry prosecuted moral failings, from bastardy to Sabbath breaking, not out of a Puritan zeal for personal holiness, but out of a Cavalier focus on social order. Under the Cavalier understanding of church and state, a view implemented and exercised by the Cavalier-cultured Virginia Gentry, the parish was an intertwined organism where the head was responsible for the behavior of the hands. It was how they established the moral basis of their rule and ensured moral anarchy would not result, though they were still not Puritans. By 1675, the Old Dominion's ruling class was formed. The wilderness had not swallowed the Cavalier had mastered the wilderness. This was the moment of the flowering of the gentry. The first families were no longer just merchants or frontier-based remnants from the time before a socially upending civil war. They were a planter elite who were mimicking the Cavalier strain of the British gentry and creating the foundation of that rule not just by seizing and holding political power, but by engrossing the land and building hugely enlarged estates that could support their efforts to transform the raw edges of the frontier into highly refined, productive domains. Their power was inextricably linked with the culture of the English manor. The manners, the legal traditions, and the hierarchies were woven into the soil of the Old Dominion, all of which was informed by the culture of the Cavaliers who fled to Virginia and added so much to the culture of the state. So, to answer the question from the start, was the Virginia Cavalier of myth and memory real? Mostly. Cavaliers did flee to the state before, during, and after the Civil War. The culture of the state did generally develop from what they brought with them. The political culture, plantation culture, social culture, and all the rest that made Virginia the Old Dominion rather than just Massachusetts in the South was refined thanks to that Cavalier culture. But, and this is a big but, the men who formed the first families and most of the topping people, not to mention the population of Virginia as a whole, were largely not the second sons of the aristocracy of myth. There were a couple of these, and somewhat more from the landed gentry, so some. But most of those who became the Cavalier colony's leading men were not such second sons or gentry. They, like the Byrds or the Carters, were largely merchants or sons of merchants and came to Virginia so that they could use their small portions or fortunes to accumulate estates and live like the Cavaliers of England in lifestyles funded by tobacco. In this attitude, the idea they adopted of being the Fifth Crown, the Old Dominion, the Cavalier colony, did not dissipate over time, but strengthened. It became something they and the other Southerners wished to accentuate. In fact, as Gordon Wood notes in his Empire of Liberty, speaking of the post-war revolutionary generation, quote, many Southern aristocrats began emphasizing their Cavalier status in contrast to the money-grubbing Northern Yankees. They were fond of saying that they were real gentlemen, a rare thing in America, end quote. This was something others noted as well. When a Frenchman named Chevalier de Cachelot toured America during the Revolution, he contrasted the industrious but cold and unpleasant Puritans of New England with Virginians. As he put it, quote, the Virginian of pure race is frank, hearty, open, cordial in his manners, noble in his sentiments, elevated in his notions. He is a worthy descendant of the English gentleman, end quote. The Cavalier spirit had won, even if its bloodlines were rarer than some might prefer to admit. But a question remained. How would this elite maintain their vision as the colony grew? How would they enforce this culture as they pushed further inland? How would they make themselves permanent? Next time on the Old World Show, that's what we'll explore. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Please make sure to share and like this video if you did indeed like it. And I'll see you again next time. Bye.